looking at the ATO and some of the issues around them, I'm joined on the line by Senator for New South Wales, David Leyonhjelm, who is from the Liberal Democrat Party. Senator, good morning. Thanks for being on the show.
Good morning.
Can you just describe what your main concerns are about the ATO? You're saying that their powers are pretty much an overreach.
Yes, it's a big difference from the normal situation. If you're accused of a crime, somebody says you're a fraudster or a thief or a rapist or something like that, and you say, no, I'm not, and the onus is on the accuser to say, yes, you are, and to prove it, and they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. In the case of tax, the ATO can say you owe a certain amount of tax, and they can decide what that figure is, and then it's up to you to prove that you don't owe that tax. And not only that, they can demand that you actually pay that tax, even though it hasn't been to court, hasn't been established that you owe it, and you're protesting that you don't owe it at all. So you can be very, very substantially out of pocket, and in some cases your business can be essentially bankrupted, put out of business because of the amount of money you have to pay.
I mean, as a Liberal Democrat senator, you tend to be against bureaucracy and government intervention and to try and keep government as small as possible. So what sort of solution could we look at that doesn't just involve adding new bodies and new layers of bureaucracy to investigate?
Well, obviously, as Liberal Democrats, yes, we favour a much lower rate of tax overall. Our policy is for 20% company tax and for abolition of various sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco and things like that, and much lower personal tax rates as well. But still, we don't argue that you shouldn't pay tax. We're quite comfortable with the idea that some things need to be done by the government, and therefore cheating on your taxes is not a good thing to do because the government does have some legitimate uses for the tax revenue. However, we're also very big on natural justice and not undoing the fundamental rights of presumption of innocence and the right not to incriminate yourself and that sort of thing. So what the ATO needs, I think, is an external reviewer, somebody who can, or some organisation that can look at these cases when they say to a business, you owe us $1 million in tax, and the business says, no, I don't, and I can't afford to pay it anyway, and we will eventually argue this in court, perhaps, but in the meantime, the ATO says, well, you've got to pay the $1 million anyway, and of course then the business can't even afford to hire a lawyer. They need to be able to go to some external organisation outside the ATO and a tribunal or appeal body of some description and say this is not reasonable, and can set aside the decision pending a more reasonable hearing to discover the facts and find out how legitimate the claim is.
And the stakes are very high. I mean, you say here that there are issues that the ATO has got it wrong, made the wrong determination, and that has really hurt businesses out there. So we are talking about people's livelihoods.
Yes, we are. We are talking about people's livelihoods. I know personally of two cases where one was very, very serious. The tax office froze the entire assets of this particular person. He had absolutely no money. He was living with friends, couldn't even afford to pay rent because his business was totally shut down, and they said that he'd been cheating on his taxes. He said he wasn't, and this now has been going on for something like 3 years, and it's still not resolved, and essentially he's unable to trade in the business that he was involved in. Another one, a person that I know quite well, was told by the tax office, you owe $30,000 in taxes. His business is relatively small, but not that small, and he said, no, I don't owe that. They said, yes, you do, you've got to pay. He paid the $30,000, and then 2 years later, they said, oh, no, you don't really need to pay it at all. Here it is back again. So, it's very lucky in his case that $30,000 was affordable, and the tax office could have just as easily, they have the authority to say, well, it could have been $300,000 or $3 million. If that was the case, he wouldn't have a business now. and yet they were wrong. And there was no avenue for him to say to somebody else, can you have a quick look at this and see whether you think the tax office is being legitimate here? There's nobody you can go to that'll say, ATO, you are being very heavy-handed here, and we don't think the evidence is all that compelling.
More broadly, what can we do to try and reform the tax system? I presume that you would like to see it simplified, but I think the other issue as well is, what's the appetite for tax reform at the moment? Because the Senate is obviously a very, very interesting place indeed.
Yeah. There's not much appetite in the Senate at the moment for lowering taxes. That's the issue we've been fighting over the last few weeks in relation to company tax. There seems to be quite a lot of senators who think that companies are evil things, and anything less than 100% tax is unacceptable. But there is a movement towards a reduction in personal income tax. I'm confident that the government will announce its intentions in the budget in May to lower personal income tax. I'm also confident that the Labor Party will be offering personal income tax cuts, which they will be arguing can be afforded because they haven't agreed to the reductions in company tax. So I think personal income tax cuts are on the agenda. But you're right to the extent that there is really no appetite for genuine reform of taxes. I mean, if I was in charge of the government, I would have a flat tax on personal income tax, 20% flat tax. We would have nobody paying any income taxes up to $40,000, so we wouldn't be worrying about the people earning less than that doing tax returns and all that sort of thing. We'd have a 20% tax on companies, get rid of a number of other taxes, so it would all be much simpler. And we'd probably only need half the people we've got in the ATO. It's a huge bureaucracy with hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Just last of all, the allegations around trickle-down economics. When we have Labor people on this program and some commentators, they say you can't have big business tax cuts because it's trickle-down economics and that has never worked. It's just putting money in the pockets of big business. What do you say in response to that?
I've never known anybody on the right side of politics to ever use the term trickle-down economics. I think it's a straw man argument invented by the Labor Party or the Greens or somebody like that. What they're essentially saying, though, is that a tax cut for business won't have any benefits for anybody else, not for increased wages or not more jobs or not economic growth or anything like that. I mean, that is demonstrably false. There have been many, many instances where company tax cuts have led to investment, more employment, higher wages. In fact, that in Trump's America, since they brought in their tax cuts, something like 500 companies have gone public, saying, "Okay, we're now paying higher wages as a result of that." So there's absolutely ample evidence that company tax cuts flow through. And when you think about it, companies are not some sort of mysterious entity. All they are is a collective. They're a way of organising people together so that they can undertake a business. And so if a company is making higher profits, which seems to be the evil thing, who is actually making higher profits? Well, it's the people in the company. It's the shareholders or the employees in it who are the beneficiaries of those higher profits. What do they do with those higher profits? They spend more on what the goods and services they need, or they spend more on additional offices, or expand their operations, or they invest in more equipment, employ more people, do more things, and the money, it's not as if the money sits in a bank and doesn't go anywhere. So there's no such thing as trickle-down economics, but it is true that when you cut company taxes, the flow-on effects through the economy are pretty significant. We've seen it many, many times.
Well, Senator, thank you very much for your time this morning. Always good to hear from people in the Senate because it's a very interesting place, and hopefully we'll catch up again.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Senator David Leyonhjelm, joining us on 94.7 The Pulse this morning.